a little bit, or no? Okay, this is for lunch. People aren't full. Right? Okay, so I'm going to retread a little bit of ground here. I think we all know that we are extremely fortunate to live in a pretty fabulous part of the earth. But you only have to, hop on a plane, and we're all pretty mobile people in the northern regions of Canada and the U.S., and fly south and start to see the pretty radical transformation of landscapes due to human activity as you go from here further south through, heavily log forests and, I guess, parts of southern Alaska and through the sea to the urban environments, and then into some of the truly bizarre landscapes created by agriculture and irrigation into some of those landscapes. So we do have a very different situation here. And, part of that is that we still have these amazing reservoirs for a number of species that have been eradicated essentially from large portions of their fauna range. And this is just a depiction from some work that was done on this a few years ago, looking at range contractions of large mammals throughout North America, and just highlighting a few sort of iconic species of northern systems, if you like, lynx, wolverine, and caribou. And you can see that, northern Canada and the U.S. and northwestern Canada and the U.S. in some cases are really strongholds for these species. And something that's pretty unique about these systems as well is that we still have functioning predator-prey communities, and that's something that we take for granted. And humans as part of those predator-prey communities as well, active harvesting of these populations. Those predator-prey dynamics have been largely lost in many parts of the world. And we may still have residual populations of some of these species, but certainly not ones that are harvestable. I've done a lot of work in Alberta on woodland caribou, and woodland caribou there is a relic species. Essentially, populations are so low that there's no consideration for harvesting anymore. It really is sort of a crisis situation. So very different than we have here in northern systems in large part. But they are systems that are experiencing a lot of change, both due to the sorts of natural and anthropogenic-mediated drivers that Terry was talking about, and just straight-out landscape change. This is some data that was put together by an organization called Global Forest Watch Canada for that purple region, so it doesn't go all the way up to the Yukon. But you can see that over this time period of 1990 to 2000, so basically a 10-year period, all the red areas are ones that experienced anthropogenic change during that time period, and that was anything that could be detected from satellite imagery. So the rates of change are really unprecedented in these situations. We're entering a space and a point in time that we don't really have any historic precedent for, and that certainly presents additional challenges. This is some fascinating data that was just released by NASA and published in a paper by Hansen et al. That came out last week. And this is looking at a similar analysis but now at a global scale, and this is based on 30-meter resolution data, notice data. And this is mapping out global forest cover and changes since 2000, so basically between 2000 and 2012. And you can see some red areas, and what really jumped out to me from my interest in the Boreal system. What the heck's going on here in northern Alaska? And this, of course, had these were years where there were a lot of big fires, so that's contributing to that red. But also the red in Boreal systems, at least in Canada, I suspect in part in Alaska, is also due to active change of those landscapes due to resource development activities. So we'd be wise not to be complacent from a northern perspective in these sorts of drivers. And again, some data from an analysis that was done, I guess almost 10 years ago now, kind of startling. Late extinction risk in the future battlegrounds of mammal conservation. So as you remember, I highlighted this wonderful, diverse predator-prey functioning systems that we have in the North still. But if these systems were experiencing the same sort of rates of change that we've seen in more southerly areas, we can expect that these will become, as a sort of battlegrounds for conservation. Canada's boreal forest, and I'll just by extension talk about Alaska's boreal forest as well, have also been identified in recent really the past decade as having just incredible significance to North American bird life as well. And you can see here, 1 in 3 birds across North America was distance to Canada's Boreal forest, which is a pretty staggering statistic, and it's also obviously a broad sweep. But these are really important breeding areas for songbirds, for waterfowl, for shorebirds in northern systems. 90% of the species in Boreal Canada are bird species or migratory bird species. So this starts to make us think about connections not just amongst our systems in the north, but connections between the north and the south, and managing these species that traverse just enormous areas. But many of these species are now in decline. This is a recent report that was put out by Environment Canada with partners last year. But notably, many of the populations still in northwestern Canada, and not sure about the trends in Alaska, but are faring relatively better than in other parts of the country. And that has a lot to do with the condition of our landscape at present. However, as Terry highlighted, the specter of climate change is particularly acute in the north, and so we can anticipate lots of changes associated with these systems due to those climatic changes, which are likely to also be exacerbated by more direct human changes. Which leads me to what is sort of the topic of my talk here, which is paradigms in conservation, where we come from and where we might go. And conservation science really did develop as a crisis discipline in response to concerns about degradation of ecosystems and loss of species, principally in more southern areas. And this is a radical landscape change, obviously, but it's actually not that unusual when you look at this from a global perspective. We have done, as a single species, a quite remarkable job at re-engineering landscapes around the world. And so you can see that, the conservation challenges in landscapes like this are going to be really quite different than the conservation landscapes, conservation challenges in other landscapes. And we'll go back for a minute, because what I wanted to emphasize here is that how we think about the matrix, or how we have thought about the matrix in conservation science, has really restricted perhaps the generation of novel approaches. And in this case, we're really dealing with remnants of native habitat, and biota essentially restricted to those remnants of native habitat, which are surrounded by a really fairly hostile matrix. And so the matrix in the conservation literature is considered basically hostile environment. It confers very little conservation value, and often it's not really paid attention to in terms of management strategies at all. And I think this is a real lost opportunity. And these issues have emerged in the conservation literature over the past 6 or 7 years, 6 to 8 years. This is a paper that just came out last month, Conceptual Domain of the Matrix and Fragmented Landscape, with the observation that in extensively modified landscapes, how the matrix is managed determines many conservation outcomes. And I would argue that the matrix determines many conservation outcomes, not just in extensively modified landscapes, but any landscape. Here they define the matrix as starts out okay from our perspective, extensive land cover with different types of land cover embedded within it, so the detachment, if you like. But then it goes on to say the matrix does not provide for self-sustaining populations in some species which are dependent upon attachment. So it is very much this conservation perspective where the emphasis is on those remnant patches embedded in largely unsuitable landscapes, and the conservation emphasis has been on planning for those patches. Now back to the north. So what is the matrix in the northern context? Well, the matrix is this broad swath of land that still support many of the values that they always have, the natural values, the cultural values. And so to sort of return to origins here, if we just go to a straight sort of dictionary definition of matrix, we see a couple of examples here. A situation or surrounding substance within which something else originates, develops, or is contained, which gives form or origin to anything. An enclosure within which something originates or develops. And very interesting, the root of this is the Latin mother, or the womb. So it's a nourishing environment. It's not a hostile environment if you go to the root of matrix. So we really have sort of twisted it in conservation science to take on a connotation that is really different than what the original intent of this was. Which moves me into sort of a discussion about reactive versus proactive planning. And whereas in landscapes further south and within the conservation science literature, the emphasis, and the conservation planning sort of forum, the emphasis has been really very much on managing scarcity. We need to think about in northern systems the opportunity to maintain integrity. And I'm now my mind's sort of thinking about this language, and I was looking at Shirley's table this morning and thinking about integrity versus sustaining social ecological systems, but I think we'll get there through some of what I want to say today. So this is really sort of flipping things around in terms of the emphasis of how we approach the question. Well, conservation science has had broad regional conservation goals, perhaps not quite since its inception, but certain region, and we've done a pretty good job within the conservation science and conservation planning community of thinking about representation of native ecosystem types or vegetation types, and more recently thinking about things like maintenance of viable populations, minimum viable populations, typically. But we really haven't gotten to these other two stages of conservation planning that deal with maintenance of ecological and evolutionary processes and designing and managing these systems to be resilient. And these are obviously critical needs as we look at these times of rapid change and incredible opportunities when we think about what we might actually achieve in northern systems. And so here I've depicted essentially two conservation models, if you like. And on the left is what are referred to as the classic conservation model, where we've got patches of remnant habitat embedded in this largely altered landscape, which is considered degraded land. And, you know, it's often not very difficult to come up with conservation plans in these areas because your options are actually really quite limited. It's often a bit of a land grab to get the last pieces of remnant habitat that remain, and then trying to build something by redeveloping corridors between them and linkages and basically restoring landscapes. And so there's been a huge focus on the question of how much is enough. How much land do we need to protect to be able to maintain minimum populations of species and perhaps restore these systems? So this is what I refer to as the classic conservation model. But if we think about the situation that we have in many northern boreal systems, it really is a very different context. And here, I think we flip the question around from how much is enough to the question of how much is too much. How much development and alteration can these systems sustain while still maintaining the full range of natural and cultural values that they supported? And how can we achieve this under this time of rapid change as well? And so we have a model now of what I've just broadly referred to as development activities, if you could say human alterations on these lands that are embedded in this large matrix of conservation lands. And this is what I refer to as a conservation matrix model, which is an alternative approach to conceptualizing these landscapes and to undertaking conservation planning. And so the question really then becomes, what is the domain of sustainability in these landscapes? So we generally think of largely unaltered landscapes as having high integrity. And as we change them through our activities, we move to a situation where they have low integrity, and we can think about these as providing a full range of ecosystem services that Terry referred to, and these ones as providing perhaps very few or certainly a limited subset of those ecosystem services. And the question is, well, how do we define what is sort of the desirable balance of our activities to sustain these values? What are the truly sustainable activities and landscape approaches? And we can think about this as essentially preventing these landscapes of opportunity from becoming landscapes of regret. And I just wanted to, I threw this in a little bit at the last minute, but I wanted to provide some clarity when I talk about sustainability, what I'm referring to. And these are two models of sustainability. One is referred to as weak sustainability and one is strong sustainability. And I'm sure any of you have sat around any of the time tables or been in any sort of discussions about resource allocations and conservation and those sorts of things. The term balance often comes up. Well, we have to have a balance. Well, there are different ways of looking at balance. And one says, well, balance is equal distribution. And this might correspond to sort of a classic Venn diagram of sustainability, the three-legged stool, if you like, where you have the environment, economy, and society, and somewhere in the middle of all that, the equal length legs, you find that domain of sustainability. And that's not really what I'm referring to here. I'm talking about a different model which corresponds to what's been characterized as strong sustainability, where
these parts of the eruption.
you guys want count apparently. Where, we have a different perception of sustainability that recognizes that societal and economic aspirations need to essentially conform within the bounds of what the environment will support over the long term. And we can't have true sustainability without that. And the difference between these two models, or one of the other differences between the two models, is in this one, different forms of capital are allowed to substitute. So we can have human forms of capital substituting for natural forms of capital. Whereas this model recognizes that many of the ecosystem services that are provided by a healthy environment can be substituted by money in the bank or stock or something. Those aren't substitutable commodities. So the question of sustainability is certainly an interesting one, but we really need to view it as a grand experiment as well. Like many of the terms I'll use, these are very familiar terms. We see them in a lot of literature from government, from non-government organizations, sustainability, sustainable development. I'm going to talk about adaptive management. All of those terms are out there. But sustainability is an aspirational goal. It's not something that we really know how to do at present, at least not very effectively. And that's because we have a lot of uncertainties, many of which are particularly acute in northern systems. Certainly from our feeding context, the knowledge of these systems is really woefully inadequate. And that's not at all to devalue the very important contribution of traditional knowledge to our understanding of these systems. But as I mentioned earlier, we're entering a period that has no historical precedent. And so the ability of traditional knowledge to provide some of that fundamental understanding is also limited. We have extremely limited data in many cases, certainly in a Canadian context on the river cross-border systems. These are systems in which natural environment variability is really high. These are highly dynamic systems that are shaped by large natural disturbances, such as those we've already talked about today. Fires, insect outbreaks, floods. These are part of the system, an important part of the system, but ones we also have particular challenges in managing for. In many cases, response to development activities are largely unknown. That's because we don't have a lot of history of doing widespread, certainly industrial development in many of these areas. And in association with that, the concept of thresholds, which has a lot of cachet in management circles, true ecological thresholds are notoriously difficult to identify, and we typically don't know until we cross the threshold what that threshold might look like. And then we're in a space we don't want to be. So the whole conceptualization of thresholds is something that needs to be elaborated much more in the context of sustainability. The social license is dynamic, and certainly, again, in Canada, basically all of the lands on which we undertake these activities are public lands. And so people operate, companies operate, decisions are made on the basis of social license. And that changes both due to the political environment, perhaps the political party that's active at the time in government, but also societal perceptions of needs and demands and societal responses to risks as well. And then, as we've already talked about as well today, climate change is certainly compounding many of these issues. And uncertainty essentially increases risk. And And so I'm a fairly strong advocate of true adaptive management or active adaptive management as a way of addressing some of these issues. It's not the only solution to the problem, but I think from a scientific perspective it has quite a lot to offer. Again, a concept that you're all very familiar with, I think, but I'll just sort of put it up here so that we're clear on when I talk about adaptive management what I'm speaking about. So a structured process of learning that recognizes that unknowns, uncertainties exist in the course of achieving management goals and that increase the risk of unintended and undesirable outcomes. And that there are opportunities to enhance learning by management that's aimed at reducing uncertainties and identifying truly sustainable practices. Terry used the term embracing uncertainties, and that's certainly part of the management philosophy here. But in doing so, that there's an opportunity to support local communities and economies. So it's not separating nature and communities. It is looking at the interface. But in doing so, again, avoiding unintended outcomes to the extent possible and not foreclosing future opportunities. So managing adaptively. And also, and I think this is very important, and sometimes this gets lost in our resource allocation decisions, is that there's a very important principle here of maintaining flexibility, that nimble, responsive environment that we talked about a little bit, through incremental application of management actions, and treating them as experiments. And this idea of incremental application, I think, is really important because often we make resource allocation decisions in one fell swoop, and we often apply single management strategies, and our ability then to adapt over time has been severely constrained. So incremental application of management experiments is very important here. And I think, as I mentioned, this provides a foundation for science-based conservation planning, but it's not something that's really been considered in the context of either conservation science or conservation planning, although there is a lot of it within the resource management community. So just one of many depictions of the adaptive management cycle, but the important properties of planning, doing, evaluating, learning, and adjusting. So the monitoring component is being extremely important. That's the point I want to make there. So management of experiment. And then linking back to the conservation matrix model, experiments answer the question of how much is too much. But there's an important corollary to doing experiments, which is that they require control if we're going to treat them in a scientific sense. And so I, along with others, have spent quite a bit of time thinking about the role of ecological benchmarks and the sort of framework. Their contribution as control of reference sites for understanding the dynamics of natural ecosystems and their response to human activities. And I'm not talking here about benchmarks as being museums or being static entities, so it's not the same as a baseline per se. These are dynamic living laboratories that allow us to track the trajectory of change that's happening in these systems in the absence of direct human activities, and provide some measure by which we can evaluate the efficacy of our management strategies in achieving those broader goals. And here's where we have the opportunity to bring together what I refer to here as ships in the night, which are the areas of conservation and resource management. And whether we look at institutions or scientific disciplines or organizations, we really have historically treated these as silos. So we have different management agencies that deal with conservation and resource management. We have different scientific disciplines, different researchers who publish in different scientific journals. And we have different non-government organizations, whether they're industry trade organizations or environmental organizations that are dealing with the conservation side of the equation and the resource management side of the equation, not recognizing really that it's not two sides. These are activities that are all happening on the same landscape, and there's a real need to take a systems approach. And this lack of integration, I think, has really hampered the identification of solutions. Now, cognizant of the time here, we want to break at 12. Okay. This is a little bit of a blend between the why and the how, but I just want to identify, without spending a lot of time on it, some important components of the systems approach to conservation planning that are referred to as the conservation matrix model. So we first recognize that the full landscape has some conservation values across the landscape, and that maintaining the properties of the conservation matrix to support these values is a really critical function. This, again, is from some recent work. That was from that earlier paper I mentioned, which was dealing with the role of the matrix in highly fragmented landscapes. And they identified three what they call core effects associated with the landscape matrix. So things like movement and dispersal of organisms, the resource things in the matrix, and the abiotic environment of patches, and ways in which alterations of these landscapes could change those functions. So we can think about the necessary management of these landscapes to maintain those functions. Of course, in most landscapes, we're going to have some permanent infrastructure. So this is, again, schematized, obviously. But interestingly enough, actually, in many of the northern landscapes in Canada, and also I think in some areas in Alaska, we still actually have a lot of roadless areas. Roadless areas that don't just exist as national parks or recognized reserves of some kind, but are this large landscape matrix. Decisions about how to develop infrastructure and particular access in these areas is probably one of the most important decisions that's made as part of land use planning and conservation planning, because access can certainly facilitate development activities and in some cases even induce it. And the issues associated with cumulative effects often have to do at a fundamental level with poor access management decisions. So now I've added to our schematized landscapes some ecological benchmarks, and we can recognize a number of properties that we'd like them to perform. So as I've already mentioned, the ecological reference sites, and also insurance policies for managing risk. And these have a number of important additional criteria. We'd like them to be relatively unaltered or intact. These are the best we can do in terms of approximating the, not the historic conditions necessarily, but the natural conditions, these living dynamic laboratories. We'd like them to be representative of ecological variation because we're undertaking our activities under a variety of ecological circumstances. And ideally, we'd like them to be large enough to maintain key ecological processes and also to do this in the face of changes in the dynamics of these spaces as well. Now, within a conservation planning context, we're not expecting that ecological benchmarks will necessarily serve all conservation roles, so there's certainly still a need to think about other sorts of values that might require site-specific protection measures. And these are often referred to as special elements. These could be areas of cultural significance, things like rare species occurrences, and thinking outside the box, things like early open water and burning systems that are really important to certain species. Now I've added what I refer to here just as an active management zone. And this is a component of the landscape now, so we're still dealing with the whole system, but a component of this landscape to which we've assigned particular development aspirations. So this could be a forestry tenure, it could be mining claims or mining activity, it could be a hydroelectric development. The extent of the duration of activities on this could vary, and overall the landscape under this model will be managed under principles of sustainability and adaptive management. But we've given it a different color to the matrix now because we have perhaps allowed them for other values to supersede the base conservation values, and with that we've assumed some additional risk. And then we've got yet another level of the matrix here where we've got active management sites within these management zones, which could be things like individual cutback blocks or mining things that have in fact been developed, so realized footprints, potential footprints associated with the mining claims. And here we've got the principle that they would be managed under adaptive management to identify truly sustainable practices. So incremental implementation and effectiveness monitoring are key attributes. So overall, this is a different way of looking at conservation planning. It's a new framework for landscape conservation that has these different properties, if you like, of being proactive, which is what we've been talking about today, the opportunity to be proactive. Also being precautionary. So the idea of incremental decision-making. Comprehensive. And so instead of planning for your conservation land, you're planning for your resource management land, you're taking a systems approach and recognizing that all of these landscape elements can and really must contribute to overall conservation objectives and to achieving sustainable management. And the approach is very much on focusing to maintain or managing for landscape processes that support ecological integrity and ecological functions rather than managing to minimum critical levels. And we could certainly add to this managing for that socio-ecological interface. Now, I'm going to skip over these slides and maybe we'll come back to them tomorrow. We'll see how things go. But this was just speaking about some of the work that's been undertaken to try and quantify some of these attributes of ecological benchmarks in particular. So pardon me skipping through, but just to emphasize here, in talking about key ecological processes that shape large landscapes at large scale, very much thinking about hydrological flows, so the major water processes that define these landscapes, and the important natural drivers of landscape change like fire and insect outbreaks. The outcome of this work has been to identify the benchmark potential across boreal regions of Canada. So all of the areas here in bucket colored, the aggregate area to contribute to systematic benchmarks. These are not all suggested as aggregate area benchmarking. Here we've got an example network of benchmarks that use the property of being intact, of representing ecological variation, of individually being sufficiently large to maintain ecological processes over time in states of change, and also having high hydrological connectivity, so basically protecting watersheds and downstream flows. Now, I'd expected when I put together this talk that we would have already talked about conservation planning for climate. So I don't have a lot of background to this slide, but this is work actually that was sponsored in part by the Arctic LCC, and this was conducted by a PhD student of mine, Fiona Schmiegelow at the University of Alberta. And here we've got, and this is like the episode that actually a map that goes across Boreal Canada and into Alaska. Deanna's been looking at projecting climatic conditions for boreal pasturing species, so boreal pasturing species over the next century or so. And she's used an ensemble of climate projections and quantified uncertainty associated with those and the magnitude of change expected. But what I just want to show you in this particular description is that, thinking about climate change for fuchsia from a conservation planning perspective is really important. Here we've got, and I guess, watch the ball, watch the green areas, which are the climate refugia over time. So the yellow area is, if you like, the portions of the present distribution, and the brighter green areas where we expect the distribution to move in the future given the changes in climatic conditions, and the green areas are the area of overlap between those, or the refugia. So here's the period up to 2040, up to 2070, and in the year 2100. And at this point in time, climate refugia accounts for about 40% of the current, or 34% of the current distribution of these species. So that climate space is going to be very important in terms of planning for the conservation of many species over time. So we talked about sort of assisted migration of trees. We can talk about assisted migration of species as well. But a more cautionary approach would be to try and manage forest diffusion as well. Now, birds obviously have greater dispersibility than many other species, but we can identify these sorts of areas now and build them into our conservation planning approaches. Now, I just want to spend a little bit of time talking about how some of these concepts are being applied now in various exercises across Canada. And I'm sorry I don't have any Alaska examples, but what I hope to gain, I guess, by participating in meetings like this is to learn more about what you're doing here and think about how the concepts fit and can be adapted and can be enhanced over time. The Northwest Territories government, and unfortunately we don't have any. Do we have anyone from the NWT actually on the steering committee of the LCC? Okay. So the Northwest Territories undertook a fairly extensive planning exercise for protected areas called the Northwest Territories Protected Area Strategy. That looked at goals both related to, goal one related essentially to community-based identification of conservation areas, and goal two dealt more with sort of the classic conservation planning approach, looking at ecological representation. And as part of assisting with this process, we helped them to look at the ability of, or the suitability of some of these areas to also serve as ecological benchmarks. The NWT government, I would say at this point, is actually being very proactive with respect to consideration of land management. They're moving towards full devolution of federal responsibilities to territorial responsibilities as of April of 2014. And they've just recently established an advisory group to help them think about what some of the innovative approaches might be to addressing what they can foresee as significant management challenges as they move to full responsibility at the territorial level. Also recognizing that there have been a number of land use planning exercises associated with First Nations community and land-based settlements throughout the NWT. So some of these concepts, I'm sitting on that advisory board, and we're having some really fascinating conversations right now about thinking outside the box. In 2008, the Ontario government announced something called the Ontario Far North Initiative, and this is an initiative that basically applies to not quite the northern half of the province, but a substantial area, about 500,000 square kilometers in size, which is a little bit bigger than the Yukon Territory. And they have now actually a legislative mandate, the Far North Act, which is to support land use planning throughout these northern regions through community-based processes largely between First Nations and the Ontario government. And interesting here is that they have a joint goal of protection, so protecting at least half of this northern landscape to us, and then also enabling sustainable economic development. Now, this is very much a work in progress, and I'm not going to provide too much fanfare about it, but it's an incredible opportunity to for organizations involved with this to be thinking outside the box with respect to proactive landscape planning. Similarly, the following year, the Quebec government announced something called the Fawn North, which applies to about a million square kilometers throughout Quebec, with similar sort of dual goals of protection or conservation and sustainable development. And we've been working with the Quebec government to also look at the potential for ecological benchmarking based both on the existing protected area system and identification of new areas. In concert with that, also looking at the various aspirations for industrial development that exist throughout this region, both in terms of forestry and mining, and setting those up as true active adaptive management processes. And the final initiative I want to talk a little bit about is an initiative called the Canadian Boreal Forest Agreement. How many of you in this room have heard of that? Okay, preliminary. It's the result of the world's largest conservation agreement. It's an agreement that was signed in 2010 between all of the member companies of the Forest Products Association of Canada who are active in boreal regions of Canada and a consortium of environmental non-government organizations. And it's centered on the forest tenures that exist across Canada. So these are essentially licenses for companies, long-term licenses for companies to operate on public lands. So these aren't private lands. We basically don't have any private forested lands in Canada except for in the maritime regions. So these are public lands. They comprise about 76 million hectares of the most productive commercial forests in Boreal Canada. So you can see we're not running up here into the region that's really of particular interest to this initiative, but I think there's some interesting angles to what's happening here that perhaps provide some, whether it be direction or just points of reflection for us for this particular landscape conservation initiative. So these, as I said, are, they support the most productive commercial forests in Boreal Canada, but they also support many other values. Most of the First Nation communities across Canada live in boreal regions, boreal and tidal regions. It's very important for a number of species at risk, and also a lot of rich resource values. In particular, in the Western Sedimentary Basin, we have the oil sands here, which I'm sure you've all heard of, and that's now spread basically to the Western Sedimentary Basin, which does come up into the Yukon a little bit and to the Eastern Sea and across down into Manitoba as well. And, essentially hydroelectric aspirations for all of the major rivers across Canada. The organizations involved in this agreement entered the agreement because they essentially have been a lot of controversy. There have been very successful market campaigns against the forest industry by environmental organizations in Canada and abroad, and it was affecting their bottom line. So they wanted to move from a place of controversy to a place of cooperation or collaboration. And in doing so, they wanted to pursue what's expressed here, shared desires for a renewed and more competitive, sustainable forest sector, but importantly also robust northern communities, vibrant wilderness, and a healthy, fully functioning boreal ecosystem. This is a wording directly from the agreement. I haven't filtered this at all or imposed any sort of other interpretation. And they also, in doing so, wanted to demonstrate leadership. There's been a lot of questions to the Boreal Forest Agreement. Well, why? Okay, it's the forest industry and it's the environmental communications, but where are the environmental organizations? Where are the governments? Where are the First Nations communities? And if you actually read the agreement, it's certainly not exclusive, and it explicitly recognizes the critical role that all of those play. But sometimes you have to bring some groups to the table first to start working towards things, and then allow that to catalyze the engagement of others. And certainly now in their planning efforts across Canada, there are affected First Nations and governments. So those most directly affected by the decisions and those in the decision-making positions of authority to government around these planning tables as well. They have a number of goals that go everything from leading forest practices through completion of protected areas, recovering species at risk, planning for climate change, and forest sector and community prosperity, and to support that recognition in the marketplace. And I just sort of took some language out of this because it fits very nicely with the concepts that I talked about earlier with respect to the conservation matrix model, which is principles of ecosystem-based management and adaptive management, and also the provision of ecological benchmarks. And these organizations have essentially jointly developed a number of guidance documents that deal with different components. So here I've discussed the methodological framework for protected areas planning and one for caribou action planning. There is a science committee which provides oversight to the activities of the CDFA, and I sit on and chair that science committee. But the needs for the science are identified by the working groups that are part of the agreement, so the signatories to the agreement, and the development of the science work is done with full participation of those individuals. So making sure that the work is addressing the needs and resonating with the communities that apply that work. And what this initiative and some of the other initiatives that are happening, I think, that we're starting to see in Boreal regions of Canada is that they are really encouraging innovation. And that's occurring at a number of different levels. So here I've just got a picture of a fellow buncher, which is how a lot of the harvesting is done in Boreal systems across Canada, so mechanical harvesting. But one of the companies in northeastern Alberta, in fact, the one who has the tenure that overlaps with the oil sands, Alberta Pacific Forest Industries. They started up in the early 1990s. And they have a huge tenure. It was the largest in Canada at the time, 65,000 square kilometers, so bigger than I think 120 recognized nations globally. And they had the largest single-line craft pulp mill in the world. There's a bigger one in Russia now. But they did some really innovative things early on, which they continued through their process. And one of the things they did was they committed to ecosystem-based management, ecological principles for forest management, recognizing this rather large elephant in the room, which was the huge annual allocation of timber and the size of mill that we built to support that AAC, which was done largely in the absence of consideration of many of these other values. But that aside, they have been doing some really interesting things, which has been empowering individuals at various levels. And so they took their fellow buncher operators, who are local folks in the communities, basically. So it's a huge area, but the fellow bunchers operate locally. And they laid down some principles by which they wanted to harvest the forest and try and emulate natural disturbance. So this is a really foundational principle for them. But they then were prescriptive. They said, okay, here are the sorts of patterns we'd like to see on these landscapes, and here are some of the underlying principles. Go out and see what you can do. And they got some really creative landscape designs out there. Surprising, actually, how delicate the fellow buncher can be. If you believe it, they don't just have to drive to the forest. They can go in and do sort of selective harvesting and leave structure and residual material and understory and all sorts of things. But the individuals then were really engaged in the process of thinking about innovative ways to harvest the forest and taking a real sense of ownership and stewardship in doing so. The sort of innovation has also been fostered in a few places with the energy sector. Definitely a harder nut to crack. But Jim may be able to speak more to this, and I think we'll speak more to this, is some of the innovative things that have happened in the Mexico management area in northeastern Alberta, or northeastern BC rather. And they had some very strict protection measures put in areas of that management region, and very tight provisions under which any sort of development activities could happen. And so, this has fostered innovation by the energy sector in terms of doing things like putting ice roads in, just explicitly to go in and put in a well and extract a resource, doing things like teleportable energy development. And we can certainly go a lot more in terms of seeing these kinds of innovations. But I think the point is here, too, that setting some ground rules helps to encourage innovation. And these are still being done in a profitable way. So, they wouldn't be going and doing these things if they couldn't do it and affect their bottom line. And just recently in the Yukon, we've seen a very interesting emergence of technology. This individual here is Sean Ryan, and he's a local from the Yukon. He, in his earlier days, picked mushrooms and just things like that, planted trees in BC and then moved up to Yukon. And then developed these really innovative ways of finding gold deposits through soil sampling. And he is basically the second gold rush in the Yukon that's been attributed to the activity and innovation of Sean Ryan, which we may not think is a very good thing in certain respects, because we've seen a huge host of claims and development activities in Yukon. But he came out with something this past while, which I think is really intriguing, which is that he's continued to innovate. He's developed this drone system with high-resolution cameras that flies over areas, 5-meter resolution, and is basically allowing him to truth up areas of high potential for mineral deposits without actually going on the ground. And then he's developed a portable geoprobe system, which instead of going in and trenching, as they've done historically to shore up mining deposits, actually lays out a string of electrical wires at 5-meter intervals and then uses geoprobes and lasers to shore up and pinpoint those deposits. And, essentially this program, as well as having a very low ecological footprint in comparison to a lot of the other activities out there, is much more cost effective. So it can truth up a huge area, cost about $100,000 and take a couple of months versus $750,000 to over $1 million and taking, of course, a year. So it's meeting some
dual criteria there, if you like.
So encouraging innovation, and these things are really, I think, developing a broader sense of stewardship amongst
The many players, if you like, on these landscapes.
Now, this is one of my final slides, and this is just looking at stages of collaboration. And this particular paper was talking about collaboration between corporate and non-corporate interests in particular, and my arrow animation is out of sync there, so you have to ignore this one for a moment. But they talked about the 3 stages that have been looked at to date, and then this new stage, which they're encouraging and seeing emerging in some of these partnerships, which is transformational collaboration. And this is not the sort of transformation that Terry was talking about earlier, transformation of systems. This is transformation of relationships, of cooperation and collaboration. And
what I'm starting to see in some of these sort of unique initiatives, like the Canadian Boreal Forest Agreement,
is some of the characteristics that really do fit with this sort of transformational collaboration. So things like a very high level
of engagement amongst the partners, a central importance of that partnership to their mission.
In terms of resource requirements, moving from something that's just sort of money invested to developing core competencies among all of the players involved.
So enhancing that skill set to make informed decisions, have informed debates and make informed decisions. Very intensive level of interaction, the requirement for a deep level of trust, and this is a really difficult thing for people to overcome. Particularly when you've had historic adversarial relationships. And I'm not a social scientist, so I'm way out of my league in even talking about these things, but I found it very interesting, and I'm seeing some of these things. So the development of trust. Really great internal changes within the organizations, major strategic values, so this really speaks as well to the central importance to the mission, the core mission of the organization.
The co-creation of values, so not something that's just a value to one or several of the players, but it's joint processes of identifying those values that are shared among many shareholders or stakeholders. And also frequent innovation, and I think these are going to be so important as we move towards being proactive and not just reactive in our response to rapid changes. And the other thing, which I don't think I have an arrow for here, but I want to mention this on the bottom here, is that where you start to see this kind of transformational organizations and partnerships, the opportunity for external system change, for their influence on the broader communities out there is really high, and that's another thing. So leading by example, showing that these things can work, demonstrating them, demonstrating their advantages. Okay, so that takes us to our area, the Landscape Conservation Cooperative. And as I think I've got, so that's the broad objective of the LCC. And we've got our particular mission statement for the Northwest Boreal LCC there. So we've got this amazing landscape and this great cooperation that's developing among agencies, and I think there's really huge potential there. And again, I've got some slides that are slightly out of sync here because I was expecting Molly to have spoken first, but I want to sort of circle back to conservation planning and this idea of developing new conservation paradigms. This is from a review article from a few years ago, which looked at the top 10 recommendations, essentially, for climate change adaptation strategies for biodiversity management. So a review of the literature out there. And the number one recommendation was for increasing connectivity. And I emphasize that because really what we're talking about in these northern systems is not increasing connectivity, because we're not at a point where we're going to be lost it yet. We need to be planning to maintain connectivity, to maintain flexibility in the face of change, to enhance the adaptive capacity of these systems. Okay, everyone's ready for lunch now. So this is some closing thoughts, which I think are, again, I think consistent with what Terry expressed on this front, which is, from my perspective, we spend an awful lot of time thinking about what and having anxiety around what the likely outcome of sort of conventional management strategies is, instead of investing that same energy in thinking about what are the opportunities for working outside the box here. And that is where the opportunities for innovation lie, and that requires vision and commitment. But I think this kind of an organization is a really good model for advancing that. And so I'm looking forward to hearing more about plans developing. And on that note, thank you.